Hi guys, Squirrel here and welcome to my Microsoft Flight Simulator tutorial series. In this tutorial series, in every episode we'll look at different aspects of flying in the sim. This being the very first episode, of course, we're going to do a getting started. So having just installed Microsoft Flight Simulator, I'm going to help you get set up and take you through the options. In the next episode, we will cover peripheral and control setup. So if you want to see more videos from the series, don't forget to subscribe. So here we are at the main home screen of Microsoft Flight Simulator. I'm going to assume that you've already got it installed and that you've signed in and that kind of thing. What I wanted to do is take you through some of the major options that you're going to need to set and just give you some advice on how to set things up. A little later in the video, we'll look at such things as graphic settings and give you some advice about how to tune this for your own system. So let's begin by clicking on the options. We're presented with General, Assistance and Controls. Controls is something I won't focus on in this video. That's too deep a topic. We'll do that in the next video. So today we're just going to focus on General and Assistance. So if we go into General Options, the first thing we see is Graphics. Of course, initially you want to make sure that you've got the right resolution set. I've got mine on full screen mode. You might want to go for windowed. And in full screen mode, I can pick the resolution that I want to have. Because I've got an ultra wide screen, I've got 3840 by 1080. Most likely you're going to have 1920 by 1080. Whatever is your native resolution for your monitor is what you want to pick. That'll then resize and won't look stretched at all. You then want to choose a rendering quality. For now, I suggest you just go with the medium and we'll tune this stuff a little later. Next up are the camera settings. Now, I suggest that you leave these as they are for now. Just leave them on default because we will be doing a future video on camera setup. If you do encounter anything when you're playing around that really annoys you about the camera, just come back and make some adjustments here. But for the most part, these things tend to work pretty well as they are. Next comes the sound settings. Now, the thing about the sound settings is, for most people, you'll want to leave them as they are. For me, first thing I have to do is turn off music because I don't want to get a copyright strike or anything like that. Music selection here, you can actually choose between two different themes of music in the menu. I prefer color 2, I think it's nicer. Legacy is the old Microsoft Flight Simulator sound, but you'll only hear that if you actually turn on the music volume. These are obviously preferential for you. Leave them on 100%, and then if you find something a bit too loud, just come back in later and adjust it. One of the more interesting options is this one. This is the communication selection. For the most part, people will want to leave it on default. If you put it onto headphone simulation, then when you get in the cockpit, the sound is as if you've put some headphones on, so all the external sounds then dumb down and you can hear ATC better. Communication output is generally used if you've got some kind of mixer going on. So what you can then do is have your default sounds going down one channel and all your voice communication going into a different channel, and you can then mix the levels yourself. So as it says here, this is something you have to set up in the Windows sound settings to make it work properly. Just separate your communications audio from your game audio and then switch that on, and you'll be able to play with them in the mixer. Most people will just leave it on default. VHF signal degradation is you're talking to ATC on comms. VHF signals degrade and become noisy at a distance and behind obstacles. If you want that in your life, turn it on. Suggest you do. It adds a little bit of realism. Active window spatial sound, I leave off. Text-to-speech settings, as it says, when the ATC is talking, the inbuilt ATC, I should say, it will speak using the Azure Cloud Voice option. If you have something else installed in Windows, you can turn that off and it'll use that instead. Subtitles, I always turn on just because I like seeing the text written at the bottom, particularly in, like, I don't know, tutorials and that kind of thing. And this one here is when you tab out of the game, whether the audio continues to play or not. Even in full screen mode, the sim allows you to move your mouse out of the window so that you can continue to click on other things. So this is whether you want the audio to stop or not when you do that. Next come the traffic options. Now, the traffic is to do with not just aviation traffic in the air, it's all to do with what's on the ground and what's rendered in the scene. So starting at the top here, there are three options for aircraft traffic. There's off, in which case you won't see any aircraft traffic. There's a real-time option, in which case it will go online and pull down real world traffic, and then it will try to sort of simulate that. But it does require you to have, as it says on the right, a persistent internet connection. Finally, there's AI traffic. With AI traffic, it will generate aircraft, both airliners and GA traffic, and fly it around the sim, and you can adjust the density of each with these options here. When there's aircraft up and in the air, you'll obviously see the lights, but if you want, you can have a nameplate shown over them so you can easily identify them. Then there's to do with traffic that's at the airport. So worker density is obviously marshals and that kind of thing walking around. Ground aircraft is the traffic that's parked at the airports. The things that you see parked at the GA ramps and at the gates and that kind of thing. How dense do you want it? More dense obviously looks cool. It looks realistic, but do bear in mind that drawing all that stuff will affect your frame rate as well. Finally, there's the airport vehicle density. So this is the ground support vehicles, the fuel trucks, that kind of thing that are milling around. Again, you can adjust the density here. Down at the bottom, land and sea traffic, the boats, road vehicles, ships and ferries. Again, increasing all this stuff, sounds great. You're going to see a lot more stuff on the ground, but it all affects your frame rate. So be careful with these options. Suggest you just start off middle of the road. If you click down here, reset default, middle of the road, just start with that. Maybe start with some AI traffic, bring some in like that, and just go with it and see what it feels like. Next is the data. Now, this is one that's been discussed many, many times. How much data does Microsoft Flight Simulator use on your internet connection? What does it need? Well, it can fly completely offline. You can literally just turn it off here and fly totally offline. However, you need it to be online if you want it to stream scenery and data down and information, weather, that kind of thing. So if you have this turned on, you can have Bing Data World Graphics, photogrammetry. All of this needs to be on if you want it to stream photorealistic content. As it says on the right there, potentially gigabytes of data. You may have to adjust this based on your system and your internet speeds to see what works for you. Ideally, you want to have it all turned on. Next options are live real-world air traffic, live weather, and multiplayer. Again, if you have multiplayer turned on, you can connect to the multiplayer services, depending on the flight conditions as to whether other people will see you. Then we come on to data consumption. Now, this is used to track how much data it's consuming, and you can tell it the day of the month to reset the above. But right now, you can see that basically it's downloaded 7.5 gigabytes of data in total since I've been playing it. If I want to, I can set a limitation on how much data I want it to consume. So let's say I'll give it a maximum of 10 gigabytes, then it will not be allowed to go above 10. I can also have a warning turned on. So for example, when it gets to say 8 gigabytes, it's going to issue me a warning and say, look, you're getting close to the limit you set me. So personally for me, I can have it turned off because I have an unmetered internet connection, but you may want to adjust those settings based on your internet connection. Finally, down here, we have a couple of interesting things. The data bandwidth usage limit. This is a real-time download limit. So that above is how much data in total per month. This one is how much I want it to physically limit itself when it's pulling data down. So if people in your household are complaining that you're playing your sim and it keeps causing the Netflix to stall, well, maybe you can dial this. You can't really adjust the settings that much. It's just a set of presets, but it's there if you need it. And down here, this is disabled by default, but I enable this. What I've done is I've said to it, look, I want to use a rolling cache. I want you to use 500 gigabytes of data, and this is where I want it. What that does is it says to the sim, you've got 500 gigabytes to store your scenery data that you download over the internet. And it will potentially fill up to 500 gigabytes of scenery data before it starts to delete the oldest scenery that it downloaded. What that means is if I start to fly over the same places again and again and again, it's not going to have to keep streaming and downloading it all the time. It can just go to its cache. And when it needs to, it deletes the old files. Quite useful. If you've got some space, definitely think about allocating some. Next comes the flight model. Now, it should already be defaulted to modern. Modern is the new flight model that you see in Microsoft Flight Simulator. I strongly urge you to leave it turned on modern, but if you want to, you can switch it back to legacy and then use the old presets of FSX, intermediate, and realistic. But if you can, leave it on modern. Down in the miscellaneous options, you can set your language and set the pilot avatars. So these are the guys or girls that you see when you go external view and you look inside the cockpit. You can change them to do different avatars. There's a number you can choose from, whatever you fancy. Then there's some legal stuff and credits, and then accessibility. This is for you, obviously, if you're hard of sight or anything like that, colorblind. You can basically adjust various menu opacities, the color scheme that's used, the text size, that kind of thing. So, and also instantly down here, controller vibration, which I never would have put under accessibility, but I guess it belongs there. So that completes the general settings, bar going into details about graphics. Do bear in mind that all these options are subject to change in the future, and depending on how old this video is when you watch it, some of the items may have changed or be not there at all, or there may be new ones. If we go back to the assistance options now, they should all start as medium by default, which is, as it says, the middle ground. So up at the top, you've got true to life, all assists, and middle ground. It really depends on where you are in terms of your flying, whether you're new, whether you're, intermediate, or whether you want it on full-on hardcore. Let's go through some options on middle ground and we'll see, what you might want to pick. So first of all, we've got the piloting. Takeoff auto rudder, just whether you want rudder controls to be assisted during takeoff. If you've got rudder pedals, you very likely want to turn this off. If you don't have any way of controlling the rudder, then you probably want to leave it on, because what happens is, particularly with propeller planes, when you're taking off with the full power on, they will have a tendency to twist to the left and you'll have to counteract with some rudder. Assisted yoke. Assisted yoke is whether you want the yoke controls, pitch and roll to be assisted. I would suggest you turn that off and just get used to the feeling of flight. We can turn the failure and damage off later, so if you put it in the ground it doesn't matter, but I think it's better if you just get used to it. Assisted checklist is whether you want the AI to deal with checklists. There's good and bad in this. First of all, it's better if you run through the checklist yourself, because you'll learn better that way. And secondly, if you have it assisted, the AI can just run ahead of you sometimes and get you in a bit of a twist. Just starts pushing you back when you're not ready, that kind of thing. So I would suggest that you turn that off, even if it says that's a hard option. Assisted landing is whether you want it to control the throttle, pitch, landing gear, and flaps, and all that kind of stuff during final approach. You can have it on if you want to. I suggest you don't. We'll be making a video later that will help you, teach you how to land. So if you feel confident, turn it off. I would leave it off, but if you're struggling to land, then definitely turn it back on again. Assisted takeoff, really suggest that you don't. However, it will require you to remember to put your landing gear and flaps up. So maybe in the first instance leave it on, and then later turn it off. Delegate ATC to AI. Again, this is another one of those things that will run ahead of you, and if you can, turn it off and just deal with ATC, or just completely ignore ATC. You don't need it in the early days anyway. Aircraft systems. Auto mixture. If you know nothing about mixture, then definitely leave this on and just let it deal with it. We'll cover that in a future video. Unlimited fuel. I don't think you need this. By all means, go for it if you want, but you're probably better off just picking your fuel level before you fly. Aircraft lights, whether you want the lights to be turned activated automatically, I would leave that off, quite frankly. You can learn what lights are supposed to be on when, and if you're just flying around on your own, it really doesn't matter anyway. Gyro drift is something that, this is a more realistic option. Personally, I would turn it off. This is whether the magnetic gyro starts to deviate from the compass. Just leave it off. It really shouldn't be on by default, I don't think. Failure and damage. If you're just starting out in flight sim, you're not sure what you're doing, definitely turn off crash damage, aircraft stress and engine stress. This will allow you to basically do what you like. You can fly around, the aircraft won't, suddenly snap into, or if you hit the ground, you'll just bounce. So you probably just want to have that all disabled for now until you feel a little bit more confident about especially landing, and then turn it all back on again. Same thing with icing. It looks cool when you fly through clouds and the aircraft starts to ice up, but do you really want your pitot sensor failing, and do you really want the engine to suddenly stall? Probably not. So Go for visual only until you're feeling confident, at which point turn it back on. Nav aids. These are handy in the early days. These are things that visually appear on the screen, such as route and waypoint, so it will show you in the game an actual waypoint for you to fly to. Same thing with taxi ribbons. If you say to ATC, take me to GA parking, it will put a physical guide on your sim and show you which way to turn left and right. Suggest you turn that on. It is pretty handy, particularly when you're taxiing around airports, you have no clue where you're going. Landing path, if you're just learning to land, turn this on. Smart cam mode, I would suggest that you turn that on to manual. I really don't see why you would have that on auto. POI markers are points of interest, so if you're flying past a stadium or, I don't know, the Shard in London, it will highlight it for you if you turn this on. So that can be useful if you're just flying around a city you know nothing about. City markers, again, it will point out cities to you as you fly near them. Airport markers, it will point out nearest airports in the sim. Fauna markers, really don't know how that works yet. I presume that's got to be like a forest thing, but I've never really seen that option be used yet. Notification. Pilot and controls notification. Adjust whether you want on-screen notifications about control inputs. Suggest you leave that on if you're learning to fly in particular. That can be very handy. Same with the aircraft system and the flying tips. You probably want to turn those on if you're fairly new. Objectives, whether you want on-screen recommendations about objectives to take during flight. Again, probably want to turn that on if you're new to flying. Software tips, don't know what that does. User experience. ATC UI panel open at start. This is whether you want panels to be open automatically. There's a hotbar at the top of the screen that you can operate with your mouse and turn on any of these options and bring them up when you want them. Why you would want this to be on by default is beyond me, but maybe you want the VFR map to pop up when you spawn in your plane. I don't know why. I personally turn them all off. So that completes our look at all the options in general and assistance. What I want to do now is we'll jump in and start looking a little bit in depth at some of these graphics options and help you to get yourself set up so that your FPS is decent enough based on your system. So let's tune your graphics settings for your system. In order to do this, we're going to need a couple of things. First of all, we're going to need to know how loaded your graphics card is, how much work it's doing. That's easily done. You can just bring up Windows Task Manager and then click on the graphics card and you'll see a percentage that indicates what it's doing. Put that on a second monitor if you can, just so that you can watch the kind of percentage load that your graphics card is under. Second thing is we need a way of viewing what our frame rate is in real time so that we know that any setting changes we make, it's having an adverse effect or a positive effect on our FPS. There's various ways of doing this. If you're on Steam, you can use the Steam overlay. If you're NVIDIA, you can use NVIDIA Shadowplay to put the FPS on your screen. You can even use a tool called Fraps, F-R-A-P-S, Fraps. If you Google Fraps, it's a very old tool. I used to use it many years ago to record video, but it has an option to just show FPS on the screen in bright yellow letters. So that's a free tool you can download. Finally, I use personally MSI Afterburner, which is another free tool. MSI Afterburner is a suite of kind of tuning products, but it comes with something called Riva Tuner Statistics Server, and that has the ability to overlay FPS. So if I turn that on, you'll see in the top corner now, I have my temperature of my GPU, the current FPS that it's pushing out, and then this horizontal line says, stays horizontal if it's continuously rendering at 60 FPS. If the frame rate drops, it will show you as a timeline. So I find that to be the best one to use, but you can use whatever you want. First of all, what we need to do is make sure there's some options set, because what I want you to do is render into an airfield where we can, a real world usage scenario, shall we say. So a couple of things. Number one, go to your general and traffic settings, make sure you've got AI offline, and then all the numbers down here are split 50-50. That's going to give us a starting point for general airport density, traffic, vehicles, that kind of thing in the sim. Then you want to click on the home screen, click on the world map. Top left, choose the aircraft, click on airliners, just choose the Airbus A320neo, which we'll have in every edition of the sim. And then for the airport, click departure EGLL and choose Heathrow. Heathrow is reasonably complex. It's, you know, if you can make a good frame rate here, you should be fine anywhere else. Finally, I want you to choose gate 535 as the departure, so click on that. And under flight conditions, click up here, top right, and I want you to choose presets weather. So you should have multiplayer off, AI traffic, preset on the weather, then choose clear skies initially, and then slide the time of day so that it says that the local time is around about midday. Then click fly, and we'll jump into Heathrow and start tuning. Now, when you first spawn in, you may notice that the frame rate is perhaps higher or lower than you was expecting. It may stutter somewhat. You can see the timeline here is kind of getting a bit wonky. It's not settled down yet. The thing about Microsoft Flight Simulator is it does a lot of things dynamically, and that does affect your frame rate. You can see already it's started to settle down. It loads scenery in, it's loading cloud in, it's loading weather data, all kinds of objects are being pulled into video, RAM, etc. And it does take a bit of time to settle down. So if we click on ready to fly, that puts us in the cockpit, and immediately you see the FPS generally will tank downwards and then settle down again. That's just because it's rendered all the stuff inside the cockpit, which is more stuff that it had to load. So be aware of that. Whenever you change weather or time of day or any of your graphics settings, don't immediately look at the FPS. Wait for it to settle down before you make any kind of judgment call on it, because it does make a difference. Okay, next thing I want you to do is to just turn the aircraft on. You can do that quite easily. If you've got the default mappings, press Control 8. That will take you to the overhead. Turn on the batteries, which are both of these buttons here, and press external power there. That's all you need to do. Press Control 8, and you should have all the screens lit up. What that's doing is that's making sure that when we're in the cockpit, we've got a fair test of avionics. We've got displays here which have to be modeled and displayed, and that will obviously consume resources which will affect our FPS. It's important that when we do this, we are in a reasonably complex aircraft at a reasonably complex airport, and we are using different kinds of weather settings and testing it, because when we fly, we never know what we're going to get weather-wise, and we may land in an airport and our frame rate starts to tank, and you know, it may look nice when we're in a field, but we're in a Heathrow, we've got 20 FPS, and we can't even land the plane properly. So hopefully by doing this, we'll eliminate that problem. Now, what I want you to do is go to the drone camera, press the insert key on your keyboard, and that will go to the drone cam. There are default keys for this. They're not the best. If you plug an Xbox controller in, you'll find you can use that to control the drone camera, and that's way better. But the default keys are R and F to go up and down. So press the R key and just bring the drone camera up like that. And if you press on the numeric keypad 4 and 6, it will go left and right respectively. Now what that'll do is let us just look around the airport as we test various settings and see what's happening. Remember, we're in medium graphic settings. You can already see that the control tower over there looks a little bit basic. And also because we put it on medium settings for ground aircraft and services, you can see that there's various airplanes being rendered. All of this is taking up precious FPS, but it's okay at the moment. I'm getting 54 FPS. You may be getting something completely different to me. This is all about just helping you to tune your settings for your system. So given the FPS that we have, I want you to take a look at your task manager and have a look what your GPU is doing. What percentage load is your GPU under right now? Mine is on about 60%, running at what, near 60 FPS. Yours may be lower FPS with a higher load, whatever it is. Question is there more room for maneuver here? Can we up the settings or not? Well, Heathrow is in England, and England isn't always blue skies, right? Weather does have an effect on your FPS, so we need to bring some clouds in, because clouds are difficult to render and they will affect our FPS. So we can just hover up to the hot bar at the top here, choose the weather option, and instead of clear skies, we'll drop that down and choose broken clouds. Click on the X to close that box away, and there we go, we've actually got some clouds. Now the FPS is fluctuating right now because it's basically pulling in weather reports and all the rest of it, and it's having to render these clouds. Rendering clouds is not easy. If we look right with the number 6 key, I don't know if you can notice or not, but it's actually very, very, very stuttery. And at first I did wonder why that was the case. Now bear in mind I'm on the preview build, but this may apply after release as well. What I found this to be is actually flying AI vehicles. You can see there's actually one. I just saw the light through the cloud there. For some reason, currently, this causes stuttering. So we can eliminate that by pressing the escape key, click on General, click on Traffic, and then choose Off. Just turn that off for now. We don't, strictly speaking, need it. And whilst it's causing issues, we'll turn it off. Then we'll just let the sim settle down again. And then, look, it's all nice and smooth again. If that works for you, definitely turn it off. If that's been fixed and it doesn't make any difference, by all means leave it on. So if we just use the number 2 and number 8 key, we can pan the drone up and down like that. And we can have a look around at those rather soft, fluffy clouds that we have now, what, 60 FPS with. So one other thing we might want to try is just bring in the weather time and choose the time of day. And see what the sim does when you have different lighting time of day. Have a look at your FPS. Consider what would happen, for example, at night. Because at night there's an awful lot of point light sources. So we have a look around with the drone. My FPS is staying stable at, well, I say it was staying stable, it was at 60 and now it's kind of tanking around at 40 and 50 again. But my GPU load has gone up, which is not unexpected because, well, there's an awful lot of point light sources being rendered right here. Hopefully the FPS will settle down. I've got a feeling the sim is loading different things in right now. But you can see it is quite stuttery. And it's amazing how just a time of day change and some weather changes have a big effect on your FPS in this game, and it's something to be aware of. It looks like it's settling down, so it was probably downloading things, but yeah, we're back to 60 again. So I know that that's doable for me, but I can also see that my GPU is on 85%. That tells me there's not a lot of room for overhead anymore. If I start to crank loads of settings up and I fly at night like this, my GPU is already fairly loaded. I could tip it over the edge into 100 FPS, into 100%, and my FPS starts to drop. But let's set it back to daytime and we'll play with some graphics settings again. Okay, so choose from the weather option and just bring the time of day back up to sort of midday just to eliminate all the night lighting. And you should notice that your graphics card calms down a little bit. So why don't we have a little play with some of the presets for the graphics options. Notice the tower here and the buildings over there. The buildings are very rectangular, very simple shapes. Also notice the shadowing that's going on, particularly under the aircraft. Actually, you know what? I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll just quickly change the preset from broken to scattered. And that might give us some more defined shadows as well. There you go. So now we can see the sort of shading underneath the aircraft and get a better feel for it. So just do that and then press escape, general, graphics, and then global rendering quality. We want you to up that now to high end. Click on apply and then see what your system thinks of that. Now you'll notice the tower is a lot more defined. Those buildings are better lit, but they're still fairly simple. But this tower looks a lot better. My FPS is staying fairly stable. If I start to sort of pan around and see what the sim does, you'll notice it fluctuates a bit. But my load on my GPU is already up to 90%. So I know now that my graphics card is already saying, whoa, 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 whoa. This is getting a bit much here, right? This is getting a bit much. And if we pan up and look at the clouds, see what that's doing. That's fairly stable. So it's doable. Can I fly with this? Maybe. One thing is to check the cockpit as well. So if I press the insert key, just go back into the cockpit. You will always find, with any cockpit that has glass screens, you'll pretty much always find that your FPS is lower than what it is outside. And it's all to do with the cockpit rendering and the avionics. The point is, though, if you pan around, because this is where you're going to spend most of your time, are you able to fly with this FPS? At the moment, for me, this is over 40. This is perfectly fine. Anything over 30, as long as you can hold at least 30, you'll find is perfectly flyable. So in the busiest environments, when the weather's a nightmare, you're at night with all the lighting on, can you fly at least 30 FPS? That's where you want to be in terms of just flying, never mind how it looks. So press the insert key and just jump back outside a second. And you can see we've got 50, 60 FPS. What happens if I go to the options and try and put it into Ultra? Now, depending on your system, this may or may not completely kill what your machine does right now. For me, my machine is now 95% average. And you will notice that the definition on all the buildings have changed. The trees draw all the way into the distance. The sky looks lovely. Can I maintain this? Well, hang on. Press the wrong key. I pressed the number 5 key and that resets the drone's position, which is useful, by the way. Numeric 5 key resets the drone's position. But my FPS feels a little bit... It's okay, I could roll with this, but it doesn't feel smooth and comfortable anymore. So I'm pretty much, you know, at the limit of my system. I can see my graphics card is on 100%. So the frames I am dropping are because the graphics card just can't deal with it anymore. Point is, what happens if we change the time of day? We make it into nighttime, start panning around. You know, it's doing okay, but it's 100%. My GPU is 100%, and I would never recommend having 100%. What if we bring in some rain? So now we're on nighttime rain. I'm just going to press the number 5 key and reset the drone back down there. And I'm on, what, 38, 40%, 30 FPS, sorry. I'm on nearly 100% GPU. If I rotate around, it just feels a bit nasty. So I can pretty much tell you that my system is not going to run on Ultra. Just no way. But maybe there's some things that we could do to tweak things. Let's just bring it back to scattered. Let's bring the time of day back up again. And by the way, the reflections, one thing to note about Microsoft Flight Sim is after it's rained, the water remains on the floor, and if you sit and watch it, it actually evaporates. It's kind of cool. Go back up, and we'll start playing with some more settings. So this is where you can get a little bit creative. Some settings make a difference more than others. I haven't played with all of these like in glorious detail. I'm sure there'll be people that will. And also this is a preview release, so it's kind of unfair to do that. What I want to show you though is some things to focus on. So one thing is VSync. That can help or hinder you depending on your system. Generally speaking, you probably want to have it turned on. If you come down here, you can turn off depth of field completely. That will give you some frames back. Reflections are a real killer to frames. So if you want to, you know, steal some frames back, just dial that down a notch. Ambient occlusion is another thing that you can potentially dial down a notch. You won't lose too much fidelity, but it will help. Another thing is shadows. On high, this will come down to 1536, and this will come down to 512. Contact shadows you can bring down to high. So we've got our own kind of version somewhere in between high and ultra at this point, which is probably what works for me. I personally like having volumetric clouds on ultra, but when you fly through heavy cloud, you will sometimes feel it. If it's too much for your system, dial that back. Another thing is on high level, that'll be down to 100. So what I like to do is put it on like 150, and the same for the terrain level of detail. And the other thing is tessellation quality. This is like the detail of triangles, you know, whether you feel every single bump, whether you see every niche on a mountain. Do you really need it on ultra? Probably not. You could dial that down. And finally, grass and trees, I reckon you can get away with high. So these are the kind of things that I like to dial down a notch when things are getting a bit too much. And if we just let that settle down, hopefully the frame rate will come back up and be nice and smooth. So we're pushing over 50. Back in the cockpit, we're around about 40, which I say is quite reasonable. It looks good, that's the main thing. Actually look outside. You can actually see what it looks like if we go to the weather. Play with the time of day. So what sort of frames we're getting. My GPU is pushing 90 something percent. You know, it's probably I would dial something down just a little bit more, but we're almost at the limit of what, you know, my system can deal with right now. You may find yourself dealing in, for example, medium to high end or low to medium, but these are the kind of things that you want to be playing with and the kind of frames you want to be looking at. And finally, if we bring in some weather, nighttime rain is always the best. This is 90% on my GPU and I'm maintaining over 46 FPS. Feels quite smooth as I fly around. You know, I would suggest to you that this, for me, is the settings I want to go for. So nighttime in the rain, 35, 37 FPS in a very, very busy environment. And we didn't even touch some of the stuff. Like, we didn't even dial down some of the traffic stuff, which is another option that you can do. Just finally, remember I said to you that the ground things that you have will also affect your frame rates. So all this stuff here is optional and has to be rendered. All these planes, all these little, you know, guy going around with the baggage car, that's all optional. If you go to general and then you go to traffic, and here we go. So if you feel like there's more aircraft than you think you need, feel free to just bring that back. Ground aircraft, things driving around, and the number of workers. You can even bring back some of these if you don't mind not seeing. Maybe you don't even care about road vehicles, you know, just turn it off. Click apply, and what you'll notice is they all completely disappear. This is the way the sim works. They all completely disappear, and then it will slowly repopulate things again. And you'll find that with not as many aircraft and things on the ground, the airport looks a little bit empty. But you'll also find that the frame rates are a lot more solid once it's finished and settled down. But yeah, everybody's system is different. There are, you know, an endless combinations of hardware that you can have. And there's a large variety of options that you can choose in the graphics menu. The important thing is, get your FPS monitor up, get your GPU monitor up, play with the settings and figure out what works for you, but do it under conditions where the weather's bad, you're in a busy airport, and you're in a glass cockpit. And if you can make the FPS stick with that, you'll pretty much be good to go to fly anywhere. And when you do jump in a nice VFR-only plane and fly around some scenic countryside, you'll find it's butter. Anyway, that is it for this first video, guys. I've talked way too much. I hope that's helped you to just get started with the simulator. In the next video, I will be covering peripheral and control setup, so we'll be having a look at how to set up your joysticks, your rudder pedals, the default keyboard operations, that kind of thing, which will set you up for then moving on to the next video, which will be the camera setup. So please subscribe if you've not already done so. Give me a like if you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to share with your friends. Take it easy, guys. Until the next video, happy flying.